Math 1108 Test 4 Review Sheet, Section 9.5, Solve applications by setting up quadratic equations and solving them. In Part A, working alone, it takes Jerry 3 hours longer to wax a floor than Don, but if they work together, they can wax the floor in 2 hours. Find the amount of time it takes each to wax the floor alone. Okay, so there's 3 scenarios described. Don could work by himself, Jerry could work by himself, or they could work together. We're told that Jerry takes 3 hours longer than Don. So for each of the 3 situations, I'm going to write an equation that has the form rate times time equals 1, where 1 represents the job that they're doing. So Don works at a certain rate, and in T hours, he can wax 1 floor. Jerry takes 3 hours longer, so Jerry works at a certain rate, and in T plus 3 hours, he can wax 1 floor. When they work together, Don's rate plus Jerry's rate, they can wax the floor in 2 hours, so the combined rates times 2 hours equals waxing 1 floor. We want an equation whose only variable is T, so we're going to solve each equation for the rate. Don's rate is 1 over T. Jerry's rate is 1 over T plus 3. And Don's rate plus Jerry's rate is 1/2. So we replace Don's rate in this equation with 1 over T, replace Jerry's rate with 1 over T plus 3, and the sum of the rates is 1/2. We want to solve for T. We see that T appears in 2 different denominators, so the technique that we use is to find the least common denominator and multiply every term on both sides by the least common denominator. The least common denominator is just 2 times T times the binomial T plus 3 over 1, if you like. Then multiply every term on both sides by this. When you multiply 1 over T times the least common denominator, the T's cancel, and we're just left with 2 times the binomial T plus 3. When we multiply 1 over T plus 3 by the least common denominator, the T plus 3 factors cancel, so we're just left with plus 2T. And on the right-hand side, 1 over 2 times the least common denominator, the 2's cancel, so we're just left with T times T plus 3. This equation is just a quadratic equation in the variable T, so if we multiply everything out, set one side equal to 0 to get it into standard form, then we'll see how to solve it after that. So we'll subtract 4T from both sides and also subtract 6 from both sides. So we get 0 equals T to the second minus T minus 6. And we can solve this by factoring. One of the factors is T minus 3. The other factor is T plus 2. This equation has 2 solutions, T equals positive 3 and T equals negative 2. But the solution that makes sense in this problem is the positive solution. So this means Don would take 3 hours by himself, so Don's time is T equals 3 hours, and Jerry's time is 6 hours, or T plus 3 is equal to 6 hours, is how long it would take Jerry by himself. Okay, in the next problem, this says the length of the long leg of a right triangle is 3 feet, and the hypotenuse is twice as long as the short leg. Find the length of the short leg and the hypotenuse. So we can sketch a right triangle to help. And we're told that the long leg is 3 feet, and then it tells us that the hypotenuse is twice as long as the short leg. So if we assign x feet for the short leg, the hypotenuse is twice that long, so we label the hypotenuse 2x feet. Then we use the Pythagorean Theorem to determine what the value of x is. So we square the length of the hypotenuse. The hypotenuse is 2x feet, so we square the term 2x, and we set that equal to the sum of the squares of the lengths of the 2 short sides. When you square the term 2x, you get 4x to the second, and that's equal to x squared plus 9. So this quadratic equation will just use the square root method here in a minute. Subtract x squared from both sides, so we get 3x squared equals 9. Then divide both sides by 3, we get x squared equals 3. And x is, we want the positive square root of 3, because the negative solution doesn't work in this problem. So the short leg is the square root of 3 feet. That's the short leg's distance. And then 2 times x, or 2 times the square root of 3 feet, is the length of the hypotenuse. Okay, the next problem involves rate times time equals distance. Okay, so in this problem, we're told that when there is no wind, a small airplane flies at a speed of 125 miles per hour. Flying 300 miles into the wind, or against the wind, and then flying back 300 miles with the wind took a total of 5 hours. Find the wind speed, or find the speed of the wind. Okay, so let's let x be the speed of the wind in miles per hour. Speed of the wind in miles per hour. And there are 2 scenarios described. 3 scenarios. If there isn't a wind, then the small airplane flies at a speed of 125 miles per hour. But flying into the wind, the airplane will be going slower than 125 miles per hour. It will be going slower by x miles per hour. So when it's flying into the wind, the rate of the plane is 125 minus x miles per hour times t sub I for the amount of time it takes to fly a distance of 300 miles into the wind. And then on the return trip, the airplane is flying with the wind. So the airplane will be going faster than 125 miles per hour by x miles per hour. So with the wind, the speed of the plane will be 125 plus x miles per hour, and I'll use t sub w for the amount of time it takes to fly 300 miles with the wind. And then we're given some important information about the 2 times. The total time to fly 300 miles into the wind and then fly 300 miles back with the wind is 5 hours. So that means t sub I plus t sub w is 5 hours. Okay, so we want an equation whose only variable is x, so we can do that if we solve the 2 rate times time equals distance equations, solve those for the time. So the amount of time it took to fly 300 miles into the wind is t sub I equals distance divided by its rate, 325 divided by 300 divided by 125 minus x. And t sub w is 300 divided by 125 plus x. And then we substitute those 2 values into these 2 terms in that equation. And our equation, whose only variable is x, is 300 divided by 125 minus x plus 300 divided by 125 plus x equals 5. So we want to solve for x. We see that x is in each of 2 different denominators. So we're going to multiply every term on both sides by the least common denominator, 125 minus x times 125 plus x. So if you'll note that when you multiply 125 minus x times 125 plus x, the first term, 125 times 125, well, 125 is 5 to the third, and 5 to the third times 5 to the third is 5 to the sixth. And then when we add 125 times x and then subtract 125 times x, those terms cancel each other out. so we're just left with minus x squared. Okay, in the next step, we'll multiply every term on both sides by the least common denominator. When we multiply the least common denominator by 300 over 125 minus x, the 125 minus x factors cancel, and we're just left with 300 times 125. And then when we multiply the least common denominator by 300 over 125 plus x, the 125 plus x factors cancel, and we'll be left with plus 300 times 125 minus x. Okay, so over here I should have plus x. Okay, then on the right-hand side, we multiply 5 times the least common denominator. We don't get any cancellations, but 5 times 5 to the 6th is 5 to the 7th, and then minus 5x to the 2nd. Okay, we'll multiply 300 times the binomial 125 plus x. We get 300 times 125 plus 300 times x, and then plus 300 times 125 minus 300 times x equals 5 to the 7th minus 5x to the 2nd. We get a cancellation, the plus 300x minus 300x, those cancel, and we'll combine the other two numbers, 300 times 125 plus 300 times 125 is just 2 of those for a total of 600 times 125, and that's equal to 5 to the 7th minus 5 times x to the 2nd. Well, there's only one term with an x term in it. So I think what we'll do, I'll put the plus 5x to the 2nd on the left-hand side. I'll keep the 5 to the 7th there, and then I'll subtract 600 times 125. And then we'll divide every term on both sides by 5, and we'll get x squared equals 5 to the 6th minus, well, 125 divided by 5 is just 25. And then we'll take the square root of both sides. So I guess what I'm going to do, I'm going to factor 5 to the 2nd out of each of those terms. 5 to the 2nd is just 25. So I'll factor 25 out, and then I'm going to be left with 5 to the 4th. But 5 to the 4th, 5 times 5 times 5 times 5 is just 625, and then minus 600. So x squared is equal to 25 times 25, or 25 squared, and then x is the square root of 25x squared, so x is just 25, and so the speed of the wind is 25 miles per hour. So I did all of this without a calculator. Of course, you can use a calculator at any stage if you want to get actual numbers. But this just shows what you can do without a calculator. Okay, so that's all for this video.